Hi, we're at 11:05, so we're going to get started. I'm James Schulman. Here's our schedule for the morning, the 45 minutes of our morning, which is I'm going to go to the next slide, which I'll do in a second, which will which will list the members of this 21-member commission, and just so you can see sort of the context of how this document and how this map have been formed. Some of the people on this commission you will know, some you won't. And then Marisa Parham from the University of Maryland is going, and chair of this commission, is going to talk about why this work matters. Then we're going to turn it back, and I'm going to fly through 7 categories of recommendations that this report has. And then we would love to have conversations. So that's the general map. Let me just start by saying that this project had its roots and its support originally from Don Waters and Patricia Sway at Mellon. So it goes back a while. And Brett Bobley at NEH. So thanks to both of those agencies for supporting this work. And thanks to commissioners, some of whom have presented already at this conference and whom you know well, and also to 120 participants in focus groups that we've had, many of whom, not many of whom, but at least a dozen of whom are here at CNI. So thanks to everyone who has helped make this happen. So let me just run through the commission itself, who the members are, and then turn it over to Marisa. So again, familiar faces from CNI, Ed Ayers, Dan Cohen, Josh Greenberg, Chuck Henry, other particularly familiar faces, Claire Stewart, and Charles Watkinson. So those are folks that you've seen present lots of times, represent libraries, archives, publishing, digital work. But then also over the last years, thanks to Cliff's and CNI's gracious hosting, some of these incredible collection builders and digital scholars, you've seen them present here. So people like Maria Kotera and Mariemma Graham. So the commission really grows out of the work of people both who are on the front lines of building collections and doing innovative scholarly work around racial and social justice. So the doers and the scholars and the entrepreneurial scholars, and then librarians and archivists and administrators who've sort of helped fill out the picture of what it takes to build and sustain these projects. So I'm gonna turn it over to Marisa. I'm gonna put back up the slide in case anyone wants a QR code. Oh, today is actually the soft launch of this report. So Cliff, yeah, was that a clap? One clap. 2 claps. Okay, so there may still be typos and things in that. It's a soft launch. If we have comments, we welcome them. Is Charles Watkinson here? Charles? No, okay. So Charles is on the commission. I wrote to Charles when we did the soft launch. Like, I now know why publishers do what they do. It's not easy to get something out and make it work. So so kudos to the publishers in the room. So let me turn it over to Marisa. Please.
Hi, I'm Marisa Parham. I am professor of English and Digital Studies at University of Maryland. I'm also the associate director of MITH, which is the Maryland Institute for Technology and Humanities, and also the director of AdHum, which is an African-American digital and experimental humanities initiative, which is a Mellon-funded program that works both nationally and internationally, and of course at Maryland. So I've, I guess, been on the commission from the start. It's been amazing as a process to watch, a long process, but only long because it was very thorough and very precise in all of its parts. And one thing I was just thinking about, and I'm sure you all saw this just a moment ago when James put up the list of commissioners, is that I have to say, as someone who's served on many, 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 many committees, at many institutions, having many thoughts about digital work. Before I came to Maryland, I served for a good number of years as a director of 5 college digital humanities. up in Western Mass. So I think that gave me a really good sense as well of how different institutions think differently, right? So when we were putting together this commission, one thing that was sort of front of mind, and I think that we absolutely accomplished, was really trying to take into account various perspectives. It's the kind of thing we always all say we want to do, but in practice, it's actually far more difficult. Because different perspective doesn't just mean like I have a different thought than you, as you all know. It means a different modality. It means a different set of considerations. It means a different approach to questions. It means different questions, right? And so I think one of the challenges of the commission that became, of course, its greatest strength was really how to take that into account, right? How to take difference seriously and how to keep that difference front of mind while at the same time acknowledging that, of course, we're all working towards the same goal, right? So it becomes this interesting moment where if you imagine this sort of like, I exaggerate, 1 million tributaries, or let's say a few dozen tributaries, right? All arising and coming together, right? And trying to get there and thinking about the blockages, thinking about the apparatus, thinking about the kinds of things that have to happen in order for us to converge, right, into a single purpose, which I think went quite swimmingly. When I'm talking about this diversity, to be clear, I'm really thinking about the ways in which the committee was constituted by people, again, who kind of are in charge of whole big things. That's the other part of it. It's not as if it's individual. In most cases, it's also representative, which is say that in some cases, each of these people represent dozens of other people, right? And this is something else. The more I talk, the more congressional I'm getting, but like in a good way, in an outcome-based way. So I'm thinking, for example, of someone like Burgess Jules. He's the director of Doc Now, and one of his primary interests of him and his group is thinking about the really difficult questions around the archiving of social media posts, right? And it's not just a technical question, of course, though the technical question is actually quite immense. It's also primarily an ethical question, a community question. How on a commission about preservation and sustainability, for example, do you include the needs of a group that has to center the idea of erasure, right? One of their primary concerns is not how to hold on to archives, it's actually how to draw the line on when one should discard an archive, right? It actually falls under the same purview, right, of the commission, but as you can imagine, it's completely different from, for instance, a dean of a library is thinking about, whose primary purpose and primary job, of course, is the work of preservation. I'm thinking also along those lines of Kim Kristen, who is very much thinking about, so you think about Kudu, you're thinking about, what it means to work with Indigenous archives. And again, not so much the Jules question of what it means to discard an archive, but you're in many ways thinking about what it means to produce archives around which you must center, or through which you must center the question of limiting access. When so much of the drive of the work of preservation and sustainability is, of course, the question of access, open access, availability, discoverability, et cetera, right? How do you fit in the needs of a group that has to center its questions around matters of privacy, around matters of closure, of not closure, but of not being open access, for example, while at the same time making sure that those lines, to be clear, and those movements, right, are flexible. We might need, certain archives, in Kristen's example, Kim's example, certain archives where you might want them closed for X number of years, but when it comes down to a treaty dispute, when it comes down to some other moment of policy, right, when a thing, quote, happens, how do you also make sure those archives can be made in very careful ways available as needed, right? So how, in other words, when you're thinking about sustainability, how are you also thinking about the real question of access as something that's contingent, right? Versus a system that you build once and that you, of course, improve upon over time as technologies change, but that the actual question of access itself moves far beyond the technological, even as you need a technology to make it possible. So those are the kinds of questions, right, so many people are bringing to the commission. Again, on the one side, the question of discarding archives. On another, the question of limiting access to archives. On yet another side, the matter of how you make sure everything will just persist. On the other side of really concentrating on the real question of discoverability. One thing that repeatedly came up in the course of the commission, of course, was the real matter of, I blame it on the 90s or something, but the sort of late 90s, early 2000s moment of producing so many digital archives that, from my perspective, feels like almost immediately became inaccessible, right? It's not only really the problem of how we produce archives in ways that make them sustainable over time, right, the work of preservation, it's also the real question of we actually already have a whole lot of stuff, right, that we have to figure out what to do with in relation to these guidelines. So these are huge undertakings, and everyone in the committee is thinking from that perspective. As you can imagine, right, much of this also means that, yes, I'm giving I won't go through the whole commission, but it's like, here's all my thoughts and feelings. These are all things that happen. But, as you can imagine, with those differences, again, this is why I started with difference, we really had to find a productive way, not to find commonality. That's not quite the best method. It's really making sure, rather, that everyone has a space to, in fact, list out, right, their real challenges. And so less so than imagining that you're going to come to a place where people agree on the challenges and you work towards solutions, right? You work towards answers, right? You instead had to think about how to take people's various needs, the solutions they've probably have already come up with within their own organization, to be clear, and then put those solutions into play with each other, right? This is a very different model than how these commissions and how these reports are usually produced, right? Because how do you put yourself in this position where you're essentially going to say, well, we're trying to say everything, and by saying everything, we run the risk of saying nothing. But we're in fact not saying nothing. We're just saying how everything is everything, right? And how to actually make that feel like a productive gesture. And I feel like I can say these kinds of things because one of the genius aspects from James and his team of producing the report is that I get up here and I'm like, everything is everything, like the everything of the everything. And they're like, yeah, we made illustrations, right? And so when you're actually looking at the report, I think it does quite a lovely job of thematizing the various concerns, but also giving people space to not only share their concern, but to share the kinds of answers they have come to, right? And then from there, think from a perspective that has to take those things into account. A little bit repetitive, I know, but it's important to say. And the place where you'll find this, which we'll talk about soon, are in the recommendations, right? The recommendations are, on the one hand, things that are just very solid sometimes, and there are also things I think that are really important about how when you're talking to your own committee at your own institution, when you're talking to your provost, when you're talking to person X, right? It gives you a way to articulate the challenges beyond your own problems. And I think when we're thinking about not only individual institutions and organizations, but also how they work together, this is critical. That you're not only focusing on precise or specific problems, right? But you're actually working towards a mindset that makes the, at least, approach to a solution possible. In other words, it gives you a leg to stand on when you're asking for money, when you're asking for a policy, when you're asking for a certain kind of conversation, right? It actually keeps you from saying the thing that often happens. I've seen in these meetings where you list the first problem and it becomes the second problem, which is actually a sub-problem of the fourth problem. The fourth problem is actually a problem from the past, but we can see how that past has become the future, right? And it goes on and on, on and on. So again, one of the real strengths of the commission, which again began as a challenge, but I think over time we really began to understand how we could operationalize this, was again, how to make space for people's problems, how to make space for their solutions. So one thing I note in the preface that's noted, I think also several times throughout the report, is that when we're thinking about, and I'm sure it includes people in this room, when you're thinking about digital projects, right? Again, problem, sub-problem, et cetera, right? But you're usually talking to someone or talking to people or talking about people who actually did find a way to make it work. And this is actually one of the most difficult things to navigate, on a committee like this. So if you're talking to like Burgess Jules, if you're talking to a Miriam McGraham, if you're talking to a Kim Kristen, right? These are all people, KJ Lawson, you're all talking, Rawson, we're all talking about people who had a large configuration of issues to work through when thinking about community archive preservation, institutional preservation, et cetera. But they have found ways to make it work. The problem, however, is that they have found ways to make it work often at the cost of something about their own lives very often, or the team's lives, which sounds very dramatic when you say, but it's actually true. Like, I don't think it's bad to say the commission also include a lot of tears sometimes, right? Because the people who are making things work are also the people who best understand how the making it work is not sustainable. It's not sustainable, and it's where the tears come from. It came up repeatedly. I get a little choked up as myself as well, which is when you're talking about your success, you're talking about your solution, and through that conversation, it becomes clear that if something were to happen to you, if you were, quote, gone tomorrow, the work would fall down, right? And so I'm highlighting this to say that, again, when we're thinking about and putting solutions into play, this is an important sort of subset of sustainability, because one thing I know I and other members of the commission were very deeply interested in was the real question of human sustainability, of labor sustainability, right? With the digital, much as I can't believe I'm blanking on who wrote this, but when the earliest first big DH articles chronicles, like, if you want to get tenure as a digital scholar, be ready to do twice the work, right? We've held on to that ethos, rather not ethos, we've held on to that just circumstance now for decades. And as we produce more archives, produce more needs for archives, come up with more innovative ways to conceptualize the very idea of archival work, right? We run the risk of only compounding that problem. And it's ultimately something that falls on very few people. One of the most shocking things that can happen in a commission like this, and it happened to us several times, is that you're learning about this archive that you, at least for me, in my mind, I think it was this big, thriving enterprise. And then the more they talk about it, you realize this is a huge, thriving enterprise that mainly depends on the labor of like 3 people, right? And so again, part of putting the solutions into play is also thinking about sustainability, because it's also, and I think this is the subtext of the report, it's also about, as in many ways as possible, producing a network of people who know how to talk to each other, who already have a sense of the differences in their concerns, and can come into conversations with that understanding. It frankly gives you a background. If you're coming from the perspective of a library thinking about, digital artifacts, it gives you the perspective of someone thinking about community archives. If you're about community archives and you're talking with someone because you want to move them to a library, you can read the report and already have a sense of the kinds of the things that the library actually has to think about before you get to the conversation. This greatly enables the capacity for collaboration and cooperation, and also simply for reaching out and knowing how to ask questions and to find support for those questions. Because again, I have strong confidence that everyone will keep on keeping on, that everyone will be able, right, to keep the work moving. But again, when we're thinking about the human cost of doing so, we have to always ask the question of whether or not it's worth it. And of course, if you care about archives, it looks out into the room. If we care about archives, we know it's worth it. But again, how to make it possible. So I'm going to wrap up there for now and think we should turn to our slides.
Marisa alluded to a situation we all know well, which is the great digital project that disappears, right? Or isn't sustained, or can't be sustained, or can't be updated, or whatever. You all know that problem well. And that's really the problem that was the focus of this, the idea for this commission. What you all know really well, too, is that that's a social technical problem, right? And that the social aspect of that goes far beyond your portfolios if you're a dean of a library or an AUL for technology or a publisher or an archivist, right? And so what I wanted to say to this audience, to a CNI audience, is that this report is meant to be a map that helps you connect and contextualize your view of the sustainability of digital projects with the context within the institution, your institution, and across the sector. So I say that because that's a really positive way of framing the insecurity that I felt last night when I heard in the lightning talks, the NYU and the Stanford lightning talks. Anyone see those? Probably a lot of you. I'm like, oh, those are really good. They're like focused, and they're like talking about, preprints and how to sustain them and the challenges there. And I'm like, and ours is going to seem like, whoa, it just like touching on all these big things that are way beyond the range. But I realized that really the range of this commission is really getting to the broad social sides of the social technical problems. So if it's helpful to you, this report will be helpful by your being able to say, okay, this circus that I have to deal with is also part of this other circus and connect to these other circuses. So that's how I think it'll be useful. And so I'm gonna go through 7 slides. They're going to be too quick. You can get them. They'll be available. But it'll give you sort of a reader's guide to the report, which again is now out on the soft release. So the first recommendation is about community engaged work. So when Marisa invokes Burgess Jules and documenting the now, that started around Ferguson. Wash U libraries were involved. They didn't know how they're supposed to be involved. They ventured out. What should they be documenting? What should they be keeping? What should they not be keeping? So there's a set of recommendations. Whoa, way too small to read, but a set of recommendations about the interaction between the institution, between the university, and a community engaged project. And just to bring one example to mind, which many of you run across, but will make it vivid to the types of things we're talking about, is a grant comes into the institution or a provost gives money for a digital project, and it's a community engaged project, it's an oral history project or whatever. And the way that work is the way that the community is engaged on that is by giving Amazon gift cards. And then at some point, some budget officer says to the PI of that project, okay, but in order to disperse these gift cards, we're going to need social security numbers of everybody involved in the community, and the whole thing takes like 2 years longer if it happens at all. So that's a kind of interaction that, as you know, fall into the imbalance, asymmetries between university-based projects and community-based projects. There are lots of recommendations. These are just sort of a summary of them. In the report, it goes in more depth. The second set is the recommendation is to reorganize institutional research to match the changed nature of the humanities research enterprise. Again, digital projects involve teams and involve labs, different people playing different roles, and so trying to figure out how to recognize that and support that involves all your work in supporting digital scholarship, but it also involves all sorts of administrative structures and reward structures. Third recommendation has to do with rewarding brilliant scholarship even when it includes modes of work and requires new approaches to evaluations. So the highlighted link you see here is a network brought together by the Pew Charitable Trust, talking about reward structures for work that's publicly engaged work. Again, words that we all know, work that we're all involved in various ways, but this is reaching across from the humanities to the social sciences, to engineering, and to the natural and biological sciences, saying people who are doing this work are not getting rewarded and recognized in their scholarship. We in humanistic enterprises do far better if we hang out with those people who dominate the enterprise and who have very similar issues. So there's again a set of circus acts that are not really your circus all the time, but affect very much the work that you're trying to support. This one is about human capital. This is sort of about how we can grow and nourish and network the pipelines that build a field and inspire students. I mean, anyone who was at Don's excellent talk before heard that when we work on a wicked problem or we work on field building, we are up against 100 or 150-year-old infrastructure that doesn't want to move, right? Like departments are strong, and there's good to that and there's bad to that. So when we're talking about nourishing a pipeline of people who can do this work, we have to find the mechanisms to support that work outside of or bringing those long long-standing, sort of graduate education, undergraduate education pipelines into being. And so one of the things you'll see here is it says a channel within MMUF. Many of you know the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program that started 35 years ago and encourages students from all backgrounds who might be interested in the MAs to pursue a career in it. There are now 1,200 PhDs produced by the MMUF program. 1,200 PhDs, 800 more in graduate school. And 2 of those PhDs are Marisa Parham and Ben Vinson, who's President Howard, also on the commission. So this kind of mechanism of building and encouraging this kind of complicated, how is it rewarded, this kind of field building scholarship isn't going to happen by just saying to the people who are already in graduate school, do this kind of scholarship, but by figuring out how to nurture a pipeline of people who have the cross-disciplinary and cross-capacity skills to do this kind of work. This all sounds like a pretty modest agenda so far, right? Create opportunities for pollination across domains of experience within and across institutions. So again, so this is about scholarly societies that can support this kind of work. It's also about the random collisions of people who need to have interactions in order for this work to get sparked. And so you see in the third bullet here, there's a mention of Haystack. Some of you know Haystack. So Maria Cotera, who spoke at CNI last year, talked about her collection building efforts, and hundreds or dozens at least of Latina collections, digital collections that she and her colleagues have built. They found the platform that they're using by going to a science presentation, a presentation of science materials at Haystack. So we're depending on serendipity to connect people and platforms, to connect people who need support at from an institution where they're not going to get that support, to find that support elsewhere in the network. So fostering, and CNI is obviously a great serendipitous microenvironment where those kind of collisions happen. Okay, now we're finally at things where we're sort of more square in the CNI community. This is about filling the gaps in scholarly communication infrastructure for new forms of digital work. And I saw a lot of head nodding earlier when Marisa said the things that we all depend on, sometimes are the work of 2 or 3 people, and we all know what those key digital infrastructure elements are. And so there's a whole set of recommendations around digital infrastructure, publishing, and standards and things like that. So and platforms. These are issues where the full set of recommendations around this part of the report will be things that all of you are already working on. Many of you are leading, right? And then the 7th one is build the support structures that will enable diverse institutions and communities to accomplish sustainable work and preserve this content. And so I'm going to pause for a second here to say how impossible this project would have been to do without Carol Mendel. So Carol Mendel, who many of you know, really provided the organizational structure. She kept saying to me every once in a while, I said, that's amazing. How did you make sense out of that cacophony of wonderful anecdotes and voices? She said, well, I'm a cataloger at heart. So so Carol deserves a huge amount of credit. But one of the things, and Carol coming from her work in groups like CLEAR and DLF and Ithaca and being on the Art Store board, is the recognition of when we need trans-institutional infrastructure to support some of these efforts, so that every institution isn't doing everything on its own. I don't have to preach that message to you all. But that also includes bringing together funders. So the last recommendation you see here, the Pew Group I already mentioned, the Transforming Evidence Funders Network. Some of you may know of MacArthur Press Forward, which is MacArthur leading 27 other funders to work together to bring their own grant-making work loosely federated to support work supporting local publishing, local journalism. So again, foundations and philanthropies are obviously among the most autonomous animals in the forest. But getting them to have some common cause about how the interests that they have independently might support each other and might support momentum around this broad set of issues, and as well as other institutions that have trans-institutional capacity. One of the things, again, many of you in this room are very familiar with, and certainly you've heard this when you talk to funding agencies, is that NEH or other funding agencies want to support other institutions besides our ones, but their reporting requirements and their grant writing application requirements make it almost impossible for so many institutions to even get in this game. So figuring out how the human infrastructure supporting this work. Again, supporting this work is technical. Supporting this work is funding and financing. It's cultural. So all of these things, we do need to look and sort of say, where can we collectively be doing this more effectively, and where can we, those of you who are at strong institutions with lots of resources, how can we collectively support the sector doing this work, and in addition to all the things we're doing in our day job. So so I'll put up, I think this is the QR code here. Again, the report in draft. Not in draft, it's out. Sorry. It's not in draft. It is not in draft. It is open to corrections, but you'll see in it, it's longish, but there are a lot of anecdotes and stories that we tried to have the whole report come from the voices of the commission and of the people who participated in these groups. So we thank all those people who participated. We look forward to your questions and comments. Unlike Don, we did not ask you to read the report in advance. So there's no homework required for this. But we welcome questions about either the process of bringing together such a wide-ranging set of topics, or just throw us anything about what we think next steps are. We have some thoughts on that, because again, ACLS is certainly interested in staying involved in this work. Obviously, we work with 81 member societies who do things like write guidelines for rewarding digital scholarship. Writing those guidelines doesn't make it so. It's a first step. I was talking to Wayne earlier, and I was saying that every commission that gets together says the first thing they say is, we don't want to write a report that sits on the shelf. This report, like every other report, is headed straight for the shelf unless we do things about it. And so the question is, momentum is not in something like this is not a force of nature. Momentum happens because interested people don't say, oh, I'm going to read this report and carry it out. They read it and they say, okay, what can I do that is a part of this big map, and what are we doing that should be raised up and could do more and could collaborate elsewhere? So the question of next steps is really taking advantage of the networks that you all are building or are part of, and figure out where this report makes sense in terms of sort of a wall that you've run up against, which again is probably not the wall within your particular undertaking, but the wall of, oh, well, the faculty who do this say this because the provost has said that, or the vice provost for research has said no to that, or the president doesn't care about it, or aligns with our strategic plan, but not specifically enough. So we look forward to you reading that, but any thoughts on just general questions are welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for this work. It's really incredible. Hi, Marisa, Amanda, so good to see you. I have a question about that human labor aspect that you rightfully raised. At my university, I talk about productive redundancy, how if you only have one person with a specific skill set and that person disappears overnight, as I think you said, maybe they win the lottery, right, and leave the institution, you don't have anyone to pick up that work. So how can we argue at universities that are small, that maybe have budget constraints, that maybe have very small departments, for that kind of productive redundancy while still having job security?
But that last line, though. But it's a great last line, because I kind of knew where I was going with the answer, but I would have changed it. Because the real question, or the real problem, of course, as you've just said, is usually budget, right? I mean, one thing I've been working on with some of the organizations I work with is, and I love that phrase, by the way, productive redundancy. One of the sort of mechanisms we're trying to develop is something that falls between sort of lightweight training in each other's areas and documentation, right? So working with other people in your org who don't do what you do, working with them to produce the documentation about what you do, right? Of course, what's difficult is that takes time away, from the work, whatever. But the thing I've had to really change, and this is about me, is just realizing that is the work. It took me a long time, very recently to get there, right, in the whole scheme of things. But understanding that kind of work of sustainability is as important as anything else. And we've been playing around with various techniques to at least make documentation easier, to, all kinds of things. But realizing, if we supposedly have all these big old, sort of skill sets that do all this fancy digital stuff, right? If we can crack all this fun stuff, about VR and this and that, I'm pretty sure we can figure out a better way to do documentation if we just tried, right? And so really doubling down on that, because I know I'm giving a very personal answer, but what I have found is that there are no solutions that anyone from this perspective, like a sitting up here, can give that can properly account for any institution's relationship to its budget and its capacity. And even institutional budgets and capacity change over time. It's not like that's a constant, right? And so there's a way in which we have to think almost sort of deep tissue mechanisms that can become force of habit, that are part of having an org or having a project that better protect against this. And the reason, by the way, I say having people on your team involved in documentation is simply that's much less time than having them just do your job for a while or mix and match, because people are already there because they have different skills. That's not always feasible, but at least you can produce people who can close the gap if something were to happen and you have at least hopefully enough budget or elsewise to at least be able to replace that person within a year or two, probably 3, but you see where this is going.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Andy Jewell from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center for Digital Research in the Humanities. And I'm not quite sure I have the language to ask this question, so bear with me. But one thing I've observed about the recommendations, and of course I haven't read the whole report, is how familiar some of the challenges are for a long time in the digital humanities field. Let's say the example of rewarding multimodal scholarship in the current structure. Can you speak to optimism or pessimism about the intractability of that problem? And are there radical suggestions in the report about reorganizing our academic structures to meet some of these challenges? Thank you.
Should I start this one?
So optimism or pessimism about the intractability is what you specifically asked for. So I'm very optimistic about the intractability of this. I don't think that's what you meant. Okay, so this is one of the committees cited in the report is the National Academies commission that they put together on community engaged work, and that was again across it was National Academies. It was engineering, medicine, science, and one of the exercises that they did when we all gathered is they asked us they did a word cloud. Everybody says one word for what you do, and everyone said bridge builder or bridge spanner or whatever, everything like that. And my word was plumber, because I think the work of working on reward structure is plumbing. So it is looking at a diagram of what the departments do, and it's not just one department, what's the different departments do, and what the challenges there are of getting this work to match up with what the institution may have already enacted as a change to reward structures. They may have already have nice language in there about public engaged work or collaborative work or multimodal work, whatever. But then the department itself might be, or this department might be ready to do that, and this department says, oh, we don't feel good. So they're within the vertical institution blockages in the plumbing. And then there are the sort of horizontal cross-institutional blockages. Like there may be a great report from MLA that says, here's how we talk about this, here's how we talk about quality. It may not have landed on the campus. It may make sense to the department, but not to the campus-wide committee or to the provost or to the relevant deputy provost or whatever. So the forces are both vertical and horizontal. There are recommendations in the report about letter writers. Like it isn't for a dean to get the right letter writer if you have the right dean who understands community engaged work, digital work. Going out there and finding the right letter writers is not always easy, and those obviously many of them aren't senior people yet. So all these are addressable challenges. Whether they're solvable is another question. But first, by analyzing where the blockages are, and then both on an institutional level and on a trans-institutional level, going at them with specificity.
Hi, Nathan Tallman, AP Trust. I have a somewhat related question. One of the recommendations was, and where it's related, was recognizing the brilliant scholarship in these new modalities. A lot of the other recommendations are about how you get there. Did you think about having a recommendation that would reward that work, the work surrounding everything that goes into the scholarship, but isn't the scholarship itself? You know, a lot of this is bridge building, relationships, management, and that stuff all takes time. It takes away from the other types of work that we could do. Is that as important to elevate and to recognize as a contribution to this larger endeavor?
I mean, absolutely. But I also say that one difficulty I've seen across institutions is that to do so would surface the very thorny problem of how to talk about service within any given department or unit or anything else. And service is difficult because it's taken as bureaucratic even when it's not, like mentorship, for example. It's difficult because it's heavily gendered very often. It's ranked, right? And so there's a way in which if you begin talking about service, you're in this place where you have to talk about all these other things. And it's immediately becomes apparent it's a sort of can of worms that no one wants to touch, right? I'm not as good as the optimism, but I feel it in my heart. Like, I definitely have it inside. But yeah. And so I think the short answer is yes. The long answer is it's so, again, contingent on institution and the solving of these other problems. A few years ago, I know I was working on an article for American Quarterly that was thinking about the problems of assessing digital scholarship, a small, short article. And the thing I said in it that had really come to me while I was writing is that if you really think about it, so much of the problem of assessing digital work in the perspective that you're talking about is really reproduces the problem of public humanities, of community-engaged scholarship, the problem of women and gender studies departments, the problems of ethnic studies departments. There's a way in which we have a long lineage, right, of sort of institutional configurations that share this problem, right? And so there's a way in which the answer won't necessarily lie in thinking about digital work per se, but really thinking more broadly about service, and not just service as something that, quote, supports scholarship, but that service is also the work of scholarship, because it's through the work of service that you come to know. And what is the purpose of scholarship but to either come to know and or to help others see what you have come to see, right? That was the optimism.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Shoresh at James Madison University, and so grateful for this report and everything that's been said. I'm wondering if there's an effort to keep it off the shelf, a role for the council to play in asking those various societies that have a great deal of influence on reward structures and practices and so on of the disciplines for a commitment statement or an action statement with respect to the release of the report, to both help socialize it more broadly across all the members, but also get some kind of declaration of an engagement. It doesn't need to be very big stakes necessarily, but have you thought about what that could look like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it reminds me that the reason for this soft launch is we needed to get the report done, right? But we also want to build just that sort of collective enthusiasm for the report. And again, it's not like a report that has like four easy instructions, right? This is an agenda for decades. But so who has a stake in it? Well, the academic societies do, and groups like CNI or CLEAR or Lyricist do. I mean, I think there are, so getting those, sort of sign-ons really needed the report to be out first, right? Because we shared it with some people, and people were like, oh, this is, earlier drafts, and people from some of these organizations or DuPont Circle organizations, ACE or whatever, said, yeah, this is important. But I think giving the leadership of those groups time to sort of actually look at it, and we all know that it's hard to read stuff and we're all busy, but trying to figure out why it matters. And I think then if an academic organization or a library organization or a firm working in this territory says, this is why we believe in this work, then they can say something that really sort of gives it a little more energy. I'm going to just tie back to one thought that comes to mind from an earlier question, which was the production of productive redundancy. And we all know that nonprofits in general have a problem with discontinuity. I mean, a dean leaves, something changes, a key person leaves. In work that does not fit into the existing 100-year-old structures of universities, that happens all the time. Because what's happened with the English department or manuscripts and archives is that certain type of work has gotten institutionalized. And so thinking back to Don Waters' report earlier, we in our world, almost everyone will nod their head about the importance of working on climate change, right? But what Don emphasized is that and tell me if I have this wrong, Don, but that bolstering those centers that are already established, not the center that is one quirky professor got this because otherwise she wasn't going to come to the university, right? But the centers that are working on interdisciplinary approaches to wicked problems need support, and that's the best place to build out this kind of work. And I think it's because of your questions. Like, otherwise, if there isn't support in a place that recognizes that this work doesn't fit into chemistry or oceanography alone, or business alone, or whatever, that if there's a center, that redundancy might have some hope of having some support. Like, we need somebody who is going to keep this machinery going, right? So I think that, I love departments and I love disciplines and I believe in them. I think they're wonderful, but they really are a barrier to new field building, right? So we do have to build on the places where there's already some coming together. I think we're going to let you all go have lunch, but I just want to say that Marisa and this committee are an absolute dream to work with. We learned so much. Every once in a while I'd say, oh, I have this interesting idea that I have about, that we could put this in the report. She's like, yeah, you got that from them. I'm like, okay. But so it was really wonderful to bring together this broad-ranging group and inspirational, creative, entrepreneurial scholars. And so thank you.
Thank you.